I've done coloring classes in the past, but the results usually look like this. Shaded to look more 3D, but what if you want your art to look more like anime, using a style called cell shading? I got you. I'm Marc. I've been a professional artist for 20 years and now I teach art for a living. In this week's episode of my award-winning weekly series I call YouTube Art School, I'll show you my cell shading coloring process, how it went from this to this in detail. Uh-oh, class is starting. Quick, let's begin. Alright, class is in session. Pay attention. I'm also collecting mandatory donations of either 1 like or 1 sub as payment for the video and all the hard work that went into it. You gotta pay or your art will be cursed. So we're going to start by checking out the main difference between regular shading and cell shading. The simplest way to demonstrate this is with a sphere like this, shaded to look like a 3D volume. When it comes to cell shading, it's really just a style of shading. The same logic will apply just like with regular shading. You gotta keep in mind the light source of the scene, the direction of the light, but instead of using a smooth gradient going from shadow to light, we'll use 2, 3, or 4 flat colors instead. The same sphere might look like this with cell shading. Different artists will do cell shading differently, of course, but in most animes, you'll get like 2 to 3 flat colors. You can obviously do whatever you want and add more flat colors for a result that looks a little bit more 3D if you want. So anyways, what we have here is this: the shadow, the midtone, and the highlight. The extra bit that I added, I'd consider, to be the terminator, what we call the narrow zone of transition between the shadow and the midtones. This is rarely used in anime because it's more work, but it does look pretty good. I'll add it to my character at the end so you can see the difference with and without. Now, I know a lot of artists are used to adding shadows, adding the darker colors as they work on their coloring, but that's never made much sense to me. In real life, objects are lit by different light sources, so I prefer to start with the darkest color and light up my subject the same way. We're going from dark to light. It also has a lot of advantages when working digitally, and you'll see why later. But anyways, we'll be starting with the shadows and adding the midtones, and that's going to be the first step. Pushing it further, we'll also be adding a bit of ambient occlusion in cracks and crevices to add more depth. And up to that point, and that's worth noting, we're doing everything in grayscale to keep things simple. For the third step, we'll add the colors. You could technically stop there, but I'll push it further in step 4 by adding the third flat color, the highlights. And then finally, step 5, we'll add the terminator and some cool layer effects to make this character pop as much as possible. So let's get started. The first requirement for this to work is to start with a clean-ish line art to work with. If you need help with that part, maybe check out my popular class on line art first. I'll put a link in the video description. With a clean line art, I'll just start by selecting the entire silhouette and filling it up with a flat color. Once that's done, I'll want to alpha lock that layer so that I can't draw outside the silhouette anymore. It makes it easier to select the different areas within that silhouette to assign the right colors. I just like to do a quick mock-up of the colors that I'll be using before I go further, just to give me an idea, of where I'm going with this thing. These are the midtones that I'll be using, so I can save this on the side to color pick from later. So the real first step will be to add the midtones, starting from the shadow value. The shadows will be significantly darker, so we can just darken this whole thing. As a rule of thumb, the difference between the shadows and the midtones will hover around like 20 to 30% darker. Meaning if the midtones are over here, very light, I'll go about like a third, a quarter of the way down towards black to get my shadow color, and that's what we'll start with. Now though, to add the midtones, we need to first pick a light direction. Where is the light going to be coming from? It can come from any direction, but let's just have it come from the side here so that half the character will end up being lit and the other half won't. This entire step is probably the most important out of the bunch, so show it enough love, and we'll also want to create a new layer for the midtones, just like we'll have every other step on their own layers. Now it's just a matter of imagining how the light would react on the volumes of the body. That's the tricky part. If I take this arm here, if I were to shade it normally, considering the light source, it would probably look something like that. Now, just like I did with the sphere, I'll compress the shadows and expand the midtones, resulting in just 2 values. This is why I mentioned earlier that cell shading is just a style of shading. It uses the same logic. I'm considering light sources and the volumes that make up the subject, but I'm simplifying it. The thought process is very similar. So let's do this for the rest of the body. Section by section, imagining again the simple volumes I'm dealing with and applying the midtones while keeping in mind the direction of the light. There you go. By the way, you see me using the lasso tool for this. It just gives a cleaner edge, but just go ahead and use the brush and paint it in instead if that works better for you. Also, side note, cell shading is not something that I use super often, but this arguably looks pretty convincing, right? Mimicking a style is relatively easy when you understand the art fundamentals, what goes into it. Professional artists have to adapt their style all the time when they join new projects, and in my art program, I happen to teach all the skills that you would need to do the same, to draw anything your mind can imagine in whatever style you prefer. So check out the link to Art School for Digital Artists in the video description. We just hit 17,000 registered students, and to celebrate this crazy milestone, I'm offering a huge discount to subscribers on YouTube. So make sure that you use the coupon code in the video description during checkout. It'll be valid until the end of the month only. You should definitely join our awesome community. You'll be glad you did. All right, moving on to ambient occlusion. This is a step I like to add to give a little bit more depth to the shadows. It's basically going to allow us to go a bit darker in some areas. For this, we'll change things up a bit and use a soft brush. And again, I'll be working on a new layer. This is going to allow me to adjust the opacity later if I need it, and possibly also tint the layer when we get to the coloring phase next. Once again, my tool of choice will be the lasso tool, since it quickly allows me to select some areas and not others. Very softly, I'll try and darken the areas harder to reach for the light, and then you can see the effect here when I toggle the layer on and off. Oh, that's fire. Let's keep going. Colors are next. Now that I have a good base for my shading, let's go back to our two layers, shadows and midtones, and splash some colors on here. I already have my target for the midtones, so I can just color pick those and replace all the gray midtones to those using the paint bucket tool. And for the shadows, well, I'll just need to paint bucket in the darker versions of those colors. I have my target value already defined, so it's going to be this dark. So I'm just going to color pick the mid-tone color to get a starting point, go down to make it about as dark, and then for the shadows, I'm going to increase the saturation a bit and also cool down the colors just a bit by adding more blue to it. In the slider here, I want to go away from yellow and towards blue, just a little. And you can kind of do this for all of your colors. Color pick the midtones, darken it by 20 to 30%, saturate it a bit more, and mix in with a bit of blue. Done. It's almost complete. We're only missing some highlights for the more shiny materials. For example, I probably wouldn't add any to her pants if they're meant to have like a more matte texture, like a fabric, but I will for the skin, the hair, the eyeballs, any reflective surface really. And then once again, I'll be doing this on a new layer on top of everything. With cell shading, the key is to maximize the midtones and compress the shadows and the highlights. The midtones should look like they occupy a lot more space than the rest. With that in mind, here's what it looks like with and without highlights. I think it's much nicer with, because it allows us to have some variety in the materials. And now for the final step, let's make some magic happen with the help of the Photoshop layer styles. The coloring is basically done on this one, but I love to add a bit of light bleeding from the highlights and into the midtones. Since the highlights are on their own layer, we can easily add the layer style outer glow and get a super nice light effect. Check this out. Very nice. And we can actually do something similar with the midtones too. This time, let's try inner shadow, making that glow just a tad darker to create a smoother transition between the shadows and the midtones. Subtle being the keyword here, we still want to maintain that cell shaded look after all. Not bad at all. And finally, let's wrap this up with this bonus step, the Terminator. Here we'll add a Terminator to our midtones by simply adding another inner shadow layer style and playing around with the settings a bit here. Of course, you could just paint it in, but layer styles are super handy when you set up your layers properly like I did with mine, everything on its own layer. That being said, I kind of like it the same with or without though, so, definitely more of an optional step. And that's gonna wrap it up for this week's class. Hopefully you'll feel like trying cell shading after this. It's a lot faster than regular shading and it looks really good when you follow similar steps. Since everything is on its own layer, I could also very easily go back and change the colors to get a dramatically different result. Just like this maybe. Very epic stuff. I hope it helps. Let me know what you think in the comments. Also, you can get all the brushes that I used in today's demo for free as part of my custom brush set. You'll find the link to those in the video description. Go grab them if you haven't already. All right, I'll see you next.